I am finishing up the chapters of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by DiCamillo. That's promised to a class that I subbed for a while back. Chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah and Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of China dolls. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference, none of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between cough fits, she took into sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off into a corner room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wool. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks in one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while, at the same time, in his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world, to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You got to look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. The days passed. the sun rose and set and rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he didn't care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, and if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do was breathing. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and said. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't even know anything about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she was gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and the son continued, and then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was going to bury her. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally, the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Chapter 20. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I've seen. 1. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner and people pay for them. I seen it." The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back, the feeling that he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden, a feeling that nothing mattered, that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother. "Dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said, and then after a long pause he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched as the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with the deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrino?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I've learned how to love, and it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't gonna cry no more." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." Chapter 21. Neil's Diner. The diner was called Neil's. The word was written in big red neon letters that flashed on and off. Inside it was warm and bright and smelt like fried chicken and toast and coffee. Bryce sat at the counter and put Edward on a stool next to him. He leaned the rabbit's forehead up against the counter so that he would not fall. "What you gonna have, sugar?" the waitress said to Bryce. "Give me some pancakes," said Bryce, "and some eggs, and I want steak too, and I want a big old steak and some toast and some coffee." The waitress leaned forward and pulled at one of Edward's ears and then pushed him backward so that she could see his face. "This your rabbit?" she said to Bryce. "Yes'm, he's mine now. He belonged to my sister." Bryce wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "We're in show business, me and him." "Is that right?" said the waitress. She had a name tag on the front of her dress. Marlene, it said. She looked at Edward's face, and then she let go of his ear, and he fell forward so that his head rested against the counter again. "Go ahead, Marlene," thought Edward. "Push me around. Do with me as you will. What does it matter? I am broken." Broken. The food came, and Bryce ate all of it without ever looking up from his plate. "Well, you was hungry for sure," said Marlene as she cleared away the plates. "I reckon show business is hard work." "Yes'm," said Bryce. Marlene tucked the check under the coffee cup. Bryce picked it up and looked at it and then shook his head. "I ain't got enough," he said to Edward. "Ma'am," he said to Marlene when she came back and filled up his coffee cup, "I ain't got enough." "What, sugar?" "I ain't got enough money." She stopped pouring the coffee and looked at him. "You're going to have to talk to Neil about that." Neil, it turned out, was both the owner and the cook. He was a large, red-haired, red-faced man who came out of the kitchen holding a spatula in one hand. "You came in here hungry, right?" he said to Bryce. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "And you ordered some food, and I cooked it, and Marlene brought it to you, right?" "I reckon," said Bryce. "You reckon?" said Neil. He brought the spatula down on the countertop with a thwack. Bryce jumped. "Yes, sir. No, sir." "I cooked it for you," said Neil. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He picked up Edward off the stool and held him close. Everyone in the diner had stopped eating. They were all staring at the boy and the rabbit and Neil. Only Marlene looked away. "You ordered it. I cooked it. Marlene served it. You ate it. Now," said Neil, "I want my money." He tapped the spatula lightly on the counter. Bryce cleared his throat. You ever seen a rabbit dance?" he said. "How's that?" said Neil. "You ever before in your life seen a rabbit dance?" Bryce set Edward on the floor and started pulling the strings attached to his feet, making him do a slow shuffle. He pulled out his harmonica in his mouth and played a sad song that went along with the dance. Somebody laughed. Bryce took the harmonica out of his mouth. He said, "He could dance some more if you want him to. He could dance and pay for what I ate." Neil stared at Bryce, and then without a warning, he reached down and grabbed hold of Edward. "This is what I think of dancing rabbits," he said to Neil. He swung Edward by the feet, swung him so that his head hit the edge of the counter. There was a loud crack. Bryce screamed, and the world, Edward's world, went black. Chapter 22. It was dusk, and Edward was walking down the sidewalk. He was walking on his own, putting one foot in front of the other without any assistance from anybody. He was wearing a fine suit made of red silk. He walked down the sidewalk, and then he turned onto a path that led up to a house with lighted windows. "I know this house," thought Edward. "This is Abeline's house. I'm on Egypt Street." Lucy came running out of the front door of the house, barking and jumping and wagging her tail. "Down, girl," said a deep, gruff voice. Edward looked up, and there was Bull standing at the door. "Hello, Malone," said Bull. "Hello, good old rabbit pie. We've been waiting for you." Bull swung the door wide open, and Edward walked inside. Abilene was there, and Nellie, and Lawrence, and Bryce. "Susanna!" cried Nellie. "Jangles!" said Bryce. "Edward!" said Abilene. She held out her arms to him, but Edward stood still. He looked around the room. "You searching for Sarah Ruth?" Bryce asked. Edward nodded. "You got to go outside if you want to see Sarah Ruth," said Bryce. So they all went outside, Lucy and Bull and Nellie and Lawrence and Bryce and Abilene and Edward. "Right there," said Bryce. He pointed to the stars. "Yep," said Lawrence, "that is the Sarah Ruth constellation." He picked Edward up and put him on his shoulder. "You can see it right there." Edward felt a pang of sorrow, deep and sweet and familiar. Why did she have to be so far away? If I had wings, he thought, I could fly to her. Out of the corner of his eye, the rabbit saw something flutter. Edward looked over his shoulder, and there they were, the most magnificent wings he had ever seen, orange and red and blue and yellow, and they were on his back. They belonged to him. They were his wings. What a wonderful night this was. He was walking on his own. He had an elegant new suit, and now he had wings. He could fly anywhere, do anything. Why, he had never realized it before. His heart soared inside of him. He spread his wings and flew off Lawrence's shoulders, out of his hands, and up into the nighttime sky, towards the stars, towards Sarah Ruth. "No!" shouted Abilene. "Catch him!" said Bryce. Edward flew higher. Lucy barked. "Malone!" shouted Bull. And with a terrific lunge, he grabbed hold of Edward's feet and pulled him out of the sky and wrestled him to the earth. "You can't go yet," said Bull. "Stay with us," said Abilene. Edward beat his wings, but it was no use. Bull held him firmly to the ground. "Stay with us," repeated Abilene. Edward started to cry. "I couldn't stand to lose you again," said Nellie. "Neither could I," said Abilene. "It would break my heart." Lucy bent her face to Edward's. She licked his tears away. Chapter 23. "Exceedingly well made," said the man who was running a warm cloth over Edward's face. "A work of art, I would say. Surpassingly, unbelievably dirty work of art, but art nonetheless, and dirt can be dealt with, just as your broken head has to be dealt with." Edward looked into the eyes of the man. "Ah, there you are," the man said. "I can see now that you're listening. Your head was broken. I fixed it. I brought you back from the world of the dead." "My heart," thought Edward, "my heart is broken." No need to thank me," the man said. "It's my job, quite literally. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Lucius Clark, doll mender. Your head, may I tell you? Will it upset you? Well, I always say the truth must be met head-on, no pun intended. Your head, young sir, was in 21 pieces. 21 pieces, Edward repeated modestly. Lucius Clark nodded. 21 pieces, he said. Modestly aside, I must admit that a lesser doll mender, a doll mender without my skills, might not have been able to rescue you. But let's not speak of what might have been. Let's speak instead of what is. You are whole. You have been pulled back from the brink of oblivion by your humble servant, Lucius Clark. And here Lucius Clark put his hand on his chest and bowed deeply over Edward. This was quite a speech to wake up to, and Edward lay on his back trying to absorb it. He was on a wooden table. He was in a room with sunshine pouring in from high windows. His head, apparently, had been in 21 pieces and now was put back together into one. He was not wearing a red suit. In fact, he had no clothes on at all. He was naked again, and he did not have wings. And then he remembered Bryce, the diner, Neil swinging him through the air. Bryce. You are wondering perhaps about your young friend, said Lucius. The one with the continually runny nose. Yes, he brought you here, weeping and begging for my assistance. Put him together again, he said. Put him back together. I told him, I said, young sir, I am a businessman. I can put your rabbit back together again for a price. The question is, can you pay this price? He could not, of course he could not. He said that he could not. I told him then that he had two options, only two. The first option being that he seek assistance elsewhere. Option 2 was that I would fix you to the very best of my considerable abilities, and then you would become mine. Yes, no longer, but mine. Here Lucius felt silent. He nodded, agreeing with himself. Two options only, he said, and your friend chose option 2. He gave you up so that you could be healed. Extraordinarily, really. Bryce thought Edward. Lucius Clark clapped his hands together. But no worries, my friend, no worries. I fully intend to keep up my end of the bargain. I will restore you to what I perceive to be your former glory. You shall have rabbit fur ears and rabbit fur tail. Your whiskers will be repaired and replaced. Your eyes repainted to a bright and stunning blue. You will be clothed in the finest of suits. And then, someday, I will reap the return on my investment in you. All in good time, all in good time. In the doll business we have a saying, there is real time and there is doll time. You, my fine friend, have entered doll time. Chapter 24. And so Edward Tulane was mended, put together again, and cleaned and polished, dressed in an elegant suit, and placed on a high shelf for display. From this shelf, Edward could see the whole shop, Lewis Clark's workbench and the windows to the outside world and the door that the customers used to enter and leave. From this shelf, Edward saw Bryce open the door one day and stand in the threshold, the silver harmonica in his left hand flashing brilliantly in the sunlight, flooding it through the windows. Young sir, said Lucius, I'm afraid that we made a deal. Can I see him? Said Bryce. He wiped his hand across his nose, and the gesture filled Edward with a terrible feeling of love and loss. I just want to look at him. Lucius Clark sighed. You may look, he said. You may look, and then you must go and not come back. I cannot have you in my shop every day mooning over what you have lost. Yes, sir, said Bryce. Lucius sighed again. He got up from his workbench and went to Edward's shelf and picked him up and held him so Bryce could see him. Hey, Jangles, said Bryce, you look good. The last time I seen you, you looked terrible. Your head was busted in and... He's put together again, said Lucius, as I promised you he would be. Bryce nodded. He wiped his hand across his nose. Can I hold him? He asked. No, Lucius said. Bryce nodded again. Tell him goodbye, said Lucius Clark. He is repaired. He has been saved. Now you must tell him goodbye. Goodbye, said Bryce. Don't go, thought Edward. I won't be able to bear it if you go. And now you must leave, said Lucius Clark. Yes, sir, said Bryce. But he stood without moving, looking at Edward. Go, said Lucius Clark. Go. Please, thought Edward, don't. Bryce turned. He walked through the door of the doll mender shop. The door closed, the bell tinkled, and Edward was alone. Chapter 25. Technically, of course, he was not alone. Lucius Clark's shop was filled with dolls. Lady dolls and baby dolls, dolls with eyes that opened and closed, and dolls with painted-on eyes, dolls dressed as queens, and dolls wearing sailor suits. Edward had never cared for dolls. He found them annoying and self-centered, twittery and vain. This opinion was immediately reinforced by his first shelf mate, a china doll with green glass eyes and red lips and dark brown hair. She was wearing a green satin dress that fell to her knees. What are you? She said in a high-pitched voice. Then Edward was placed on the shelf next to her. I'm a rabbit, said Edward. The doll let out a small squeak. You're in the wrong place, she said. This is a shop for dolls, not rabbits. Edward said nothing. Shoo, the doll said. I would love to shoo, said Edward, but it's obvious I cannot. After a long silence, the doll said, I hope you don't think that anyone's going to buy you. Again, Edward said nothing. The people who come in here want dolls, not rabbits. They want baby dolls or elegant dolls, such as myself. Dolls with pretty dresses, dolls with eyes that open and close. I have no interest in being purchased, said Edward. The doll gasped. You don't want somebody to buy you, she said. You don't want to be owned by a little girl who loved you. Sarah Ruth, Abilene. Their names went through Edward's head like the notes of a sad, sweet song. I have already been loved, said Edward. I have been loved by a girl named Abilene. I have been loved by a fisherman and his wife and a hobo and his dog. I have been loved by a boy who played the harmonica and by a girl who died. Don't talk to me about love, he said. I have known love. This impassioned speech shut up Edward's shelf-mate for a considerable amount of time. Well, she said at last, still, my point is that no one's going to buy you. They did not speak to each other again. The doll was sold 2 weeks later to a grandmother who was purchasing it for her grandchild. Yes, she said to Lewis Clark. That one right there, the one with the green dress. She's quite lovely. Yes, said Lucius, she is, isn't she? And he plucked the doll from the shelf. Goodbye and good riddance, Edward thought. The spot next to the rabbit stayed vacant for some time. Day after day, the door opened to the shop, opened and closed, letting in early morning sun or late afternoon light, lifting the hearts of dolls inside, and all of them thinking when the door swung wide that this time, the person entering the shop would be the one who wanted them. Edward was the lone contrarian. He prided himself on not hoping, on not allowing his heart to lift inside him. He prided himself on keeping his heart silent, immobile, closed tight. I am done with hope, thought Edward Tulane. And then one day at dusk, right before he closed the shop, Lucius Clark placed another doll on the shelf next to Edward. Chapter 26. There you are, my lady. Meet the rabbit doll, said Lucius. Doll Mender walked away, turning out the lights one by one. In the gloom of the shop, Edward could see that the doll's head, like his, had been broken and repaired. Her face was, in fact, a web of cracks. She was wearing a baby bonnet. How do you do, she said in a high, thin voice. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. Hello, said Edward. Have you been here long? She asked. Months and months, said Edward. But I don't care. One place is the same as another to me. Oh, not for me, said the doll. I have lived 100 years, and in that time I've been in places that were heavenly and others that were horrid. After a time you learn that each place is different, and you become a different doll in each place too, quite different. 100 years, said Edward. I am old. The doll mender confirmed this. He said that he was mending me and that I am at least that, and at least 100 years old. Edward thought about everything that had happened to him in his short life. What kind of adventures would you have if you were in the world for a century? The old doll said, I wonder who will come for me this time. Someone will come. Someone always comes. Who will it be? I don't care if anyone comes for me, said Edward. But that's dreadful, said the old doll. There's no point in going on if you feel that way, no point at all. You must be filled with expectancy. You must be awash in hope. You must wonder who will love you next. I am done with being loved, Edward told her. I am done with loving. It's too painful. Pish, said the old doll. Where is your courage? Somewhere else, I guess, said Edward. You disappoint me, she said. You disappoint me greatly. If you have no intention of loving or being loved, then the whole journey is pointless. You might as well leap from the shelf right now and let yourself shatter into a million pieces. Get it over with. Get it all over with now. I would leap if I was able, said Edward. Shall I push you? Said the old doll. No, thank you, said Edward to her. Not that you could, he muttered to himself. What's that? Nothing, said Edward. The dark in the doll shop was now complete. The old doll and Edward sat on their shelf and stared straight ahead. You disappoint me, said the old doll. Her words made Edward think of Pellegrina, of warthogs and princesses, of listening and love, of spells and curses, and what if there was somebody waiting to love him? What if there was somebody whom he would love again? Was it possible? Edward felt his heart stir. No, he told his heart, not possible. Not possible. In the morning, Lucius Clark came and unlocked the shop. "Good morning, my darlings," he called aloud to them. "Good morning, my lovelies." He pulled up in the shades on the window. He turned on the light over his tools. He switched on the sign to the door to open. The first customer was a little girl with her father. "Are you looking for something special?" Lucius Clark asked them. "Yes," said the little girl. "I'm looking for a friend." Her father put him on her shoulders and walked slowly around the shop. The girl studied each dog carefully. She looked at Edward right in the eyes, and she nodded at him. "Have you decided, Natalie?" her father asked. "Yes," she said. "I want the one in the baby bonnet." "Oh," said Lucius Clark, "you know that she is very old. She's an antique." "She needs me," said Natalie firmly. Next to Edward, the old doll let out a sigh. She seemed to be sit up straighter. Lucius came and took her off the shelf and handed her to Natalie. And when they left, the little girl's father opened the door for his daughter and the old doll, and a bright shaft of early morning light came flooding in, and Edward heard quite clearly, as if she were still sitting next to him, the old doll's voice. "Open your heart," she said gently. "Someone will come. Someone will come for you, but first you must open your heart." The door closed. The sunlight disappeared. "Someone will come." Edward's heart stirred. He thought for the first time in a long time on the house on Egypt Street, and of Abilene winding his watch and then bending toward him and placing it on his left leg, saying, "I will come home to you." No, he told himself, don't believe it. Don't let yourself believe it. But it was too late. Someone will come to you. The China Rabbit's heart had begun again to open. Chapter 27. Seasons passed, fall and winter and spring and summer. Leaves blew in through the open door of Lucius Clark's shop, and rain and the green, outrageous, hopeful light of spring. People came and went, grandmothers and dog collectors and little girls with their grandmothers and their mothers. Edward Tulane waited. The seasons turned into years. Edward Tulane waited. He repeated the doll's words over and over until they wore a smooth groove of hope into his brain. Someone will come. Someone will come for you. And the old doll was right. Someone did come. It was springtime. It was raining. There were dogwood blossoms on the floor of Lucius Clark's shop. She was a small girl, maybe 5 years old, and while her mother struggled to close a blue umbrella, the little girl walked around the store, stopping and staring solemnly at each doll and then moving on. When she came to Edward, she stood in front of him for what seemed like a long time. She looked at him, and he looked at her. "Someone will come," Edward said. "Someone will come for me." The girl smiled, and then she stooped on her tiptoes and looked at Edward, took Edward off the shelf. She cradled him in her arms. She held him in the same ferocious, tender way Sarah Ruth had held him. Oh, thought Edward, I remember this. "Madam," said Lucius Clark, "could you please attend to your daughter? She is holding a very fragile, very precious, quite expensive doll." "Maggie," said the woman. She looked up from the still opened umbrella. "What have you got?" "A rabbit," said Maggie. "A what?" said the mother. "A rabbit," Maggie said again. "I want him." "Remember, we're not buying anything today. We're only looking," said the woman. "Madam," said Lucius Clark, "please." The woman came and stood over Maggie. She looked down at Edward. The rabbit felt dizzy. He wondered for a minute if his head had cracked open again, if he was dreaming. "Look, Mama," said Maggie. "Look at him." "I see him," said the woman. She dropped her umbrella. She put her hand on the locket that hung around her neck, and Edward saw it then and that it was not a locket at all. It was a watch, a pocket watch. It was his watch. "Edward," said Emily. "Yes," said Edward. "Edward," she said again, certain this time. "Yes," he said. "Yes, yes, yes. It's me."